and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share cryptid encounters where the people involved aren't quite sure what they saw. These stories include a woman sharing a sighting of what she believed to be a Kushtaka when she was a young girl at camp, a couple who saw something running across a field in Ohio one night, and a story from Hungary where a father and son were snuck up on by a creature while hunting. But first, we start with a story from the United Kingdom, where one man saw a bizarre creature by the side of the road while driving early one morning. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from the United Kingdom, where one poster had an encounter with an unknown creature. He turned to the internet for answers because he still, to this day, has no idea what he saw that morning. His story takes place in March of 2022. The original poster, or OP, was behind the wheel of his work van heading from Warninglid to Littlehampton in West Sussex. It was 5 in the morning and still dark out. He had just passed the southern edge of Ashington village and was coming up on what he calls the Storrington roundabout. On his left, there was a stretch of grass spanning a few hundred feet and measuring approximately 6 feet wide, before giving way to a dense thicket of brambles. As he was driving, he caught sight of a creature he says was the same color as a cardboard box. It stood at approximately 4 feet tall, but it was crouched down on its haunches with its heels touching its rear end. The creature was positioned diagonally away from him, facing the bushes. As a result, he got a better view of this thing's back and left side than anything else. Its spine and ribs were slightly visible, but not excessively so. The creature had small round ears on its head located where a human's ears would be. However, they were shaped more like that of a black bear. It had a tail that curved upward into an S shape and had no hair on it, much like the rest of this thing's body. From what he could make out of its face, it had a muzzle. He says the head movement seemed digital and all over the place. It seemed to be focused on tracking something in the grass, and its movements were jerky and erratic. When it pounced, it leaped in the same manner as a fox would, and when it did, he caught a glimpse of the soles of this creature's feet. He says he vividly remembers they resembled that of a human. However, considering what time it was and his familiarity with the countryside, where he sees foxes on a daily basis, he can confidently confirm that this creature was not a fox. He says what he saw early that morning was unlike anything he had ever seen before, whether in person, on TV, on the internet, or even in a book. He only saw the creature for 5 seconds, but it sent a chill up his spine. He was so shocked by what he saw, he even said, "What the F was that?" out loud to himself in his truck. When he reached the roundabout, he immediately turned around and went back, hoping to catch another glimpse of this thing, but it was gone. In an odd turn of events, a profound feeling of shame washed over him in that moment, though he couldn't say why. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he felt like he had no business even seeing this thing. He says if he had a regular job, he wouldn't be up that early in the morning and wouldn't have seen the creature. To this day, he still has no clue what he saw that morning and closes by asking anyone who has had a similar encounter or any insights to please share them. I'm going to be honest here and admit that this is the first I've heard of a creature that looks like what the OP describes in this story. If it weren't for the tail, I would guess that he saw a crawler. However, crawlers aren't said to have ears like what this creature had, round ears on the side of its head where a human's would be, but shaped like that of a bear. Plus, he said it was the color of a cardboard box. This is pretty baffling and has me stumped. A few things that make me think this is a cryptid and not a misidentified animal with a disease are how he said he felt like he was looking at something he wasn't meant to see, the tears welling up in his eyes, and how he said this thing's movements looked digital. What he felt and the tears welling up are things I hear in a lot of stories. And this isn't the first time I've heard of one of these creatures' movements described as being digital. Most say it was almost like the cryptid they saw was glitching. That's usually the closest word they can find to describe what they see. And then there is this thing's feet, which he says look like that of a human. Again, I'm not sure what this thing could have been, so I'm not even going to venture a guess. What do you think he saw early that morning? Do you think it was a cryptid, a diseased animal, or something else? The next story comes to us from Alaska, where a lot of weird things seem to happen. This encounter involves one of the more obscure cryptids I've heard of, but have unable to find many stories about, and that is the Kushtaka, or the land otter people. The Kushtaka, which translate to land otter man, are shape-shifting creatures found in the folklore of the Tlingit people. These beings are said to be able to take the form of people, otters, and other forms as well. In some accounts, the Kushtaka are said to be able to assume the form of any species of otter, while others have them only being able to transform into one specific species. The stories about this particular cryptid range from having them as cruel creatures who enjoy luring Tlingit sailors to their deaths, to them being friendly and helpful, with them even saving people who are lost from death and freezing. In these accounts, they are said to save the people by transforming them into Kushtaka so they are able to survive the cold. They are said to do this by distracting them using illusions of the person's family and friends. In other legends, tales have the Kushtaka mimicking the sounds of a crying baby or a woman screaming to lure unsuspecting victims to the river, where they are either killed and or torn apart or turned into Kushtaka. They are also said to be able to emit a high-pitched whistle, usually in a three-part pattern ranging from low-pitched to high, then back to low. These beings can supposedly be warded off by copper, urine, dogs, and fire. The original poster, who is of Tlingit descent, believes she saw a Kushtaka one night while at camp. Her encounter took place when she was somewhere between the ages of 8 to 10 years old. Living in Alaska, she has seen and heard some bizarre things, and even though she says she has conflicting feelings on whether or not the land otter people actually exist, she's fairly certain that's what she saw, especially given that the encounter was so vivid. Despite growing up hearing the stories about these creatures, she doubted every one of them and certainly wasn't actively seeking them out or trying to find weird things to convince herself that they were real. On the night of her encounter, she woke up earlier than the other girls in the cabin, so she made sure to remain quiet to not disturb them. Instead of reaching for a book and risk making noise, she decided to instead look out the window at the water. There was a floating dock a little ways out into the water. There she saw what looked like a man, which she thought seemed odd that he was on the dock without any boats or canoes in the nearby water. He was fully dressed and didn't appear to be wet, ruling out the possibility of him swimming out there. He also seemed, according to the OP, much older than the camp counselors. Watching him silently, she was intrigued by his presence on the dock without a way to get back to shore. He then jumped into the water, but this jump was surprisingly high. In the middle of the jump, he transformed into what the OP says was a slender, smaller figure. It dawned on her later, after replaying the bizarre events over and over in her mind, that it resembled an otter. As mentioned earlier, she comes from Tlingit background, where she grew up hearing stories about shapeshifters known as the land otter people. These beings would transform into otters to deceive humans. After seeing this thing, she would watch to see if the shapeshifter returned, but it never did. Unfortunately, no one took her story seriously except for one counselor who shared her native heritage. He recounted a night when he heard a baby crying in the forest while heading to the bathroom. The OP couldn't tell if he was joking or not, but he did appear to be genuine. I've only heard a few stories about the land otter people, or the Kushtaka. When I saw this one, I knew I had to include it in an episode. I decided to use it in one of the episodes about unidentified cryptids because the original poster says she thinks that's what she saw that night, but she isn't 100% positive. However, it would certainly seem to me that's exactly what she caught sight of taking a late night dip. There are a lot of weird sightings and a lot of strange stories that come out of Alaska, with creatures mentioned only seen there, and the land otter people are one of them. I'm not sure what it is about Alaska that has so many strange tales originating from there, but whatever the case may be, a lot of different cryptids call the state home. I know the girl in this story was young at the time and she had just woken up, but the fact that one of the counselors told her he heard crying one night while outside, which fits with the legends about this creature, make me think she actually saw what she did on that floating dock. What do you think about this one? And what do you think she saw taking a late night swim? The next story comes from Ohio, where one couple saw something strange while driving home from a concert one night. They found themselves on some back roads while following their GPS at approximately 1 in the morning when the encounter happened. While driving this back route, they were on a hilly road that had houses with a lot of open fields separating them. As they approached one of the hills, their headlights illuminated a field to their left, and the OP, who was driving, caught sight of something peculiar. Running across the field away from them at an angle was a tall, lanky, yet strong-looking black figure. This thing, whatever it was, ran on 2 legs and was heading in the opposite direction they were driving, angling towards some distant woods. This thing ran at a very fast speed, and he was only able to see it for a couple of seconds before it vanished. He asked his girlfriend whether she saw it or not, but she responded that she did not. The OP proceeded to describe what he had seen, and she believed him. As they continued to drive, they attempted to make sense of what they saw by speculating that it could have been a tree or some kind of optical illusion. However, the sensation he experienced upon seeing the figure was that it, according to him, felt really off. It felt as though he had seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. He ends by asking if this thing could have been a cryptid or if it was some kind of weird light trick that happened with his headlights. I know the OP says he isn't sure if he actually saw something or if it was just an optical illusion created by his headlights. I believe he saw something running across that field, and here's why. He was able to make out the figure and could see it well enough to be able to tell that it was running and to be able to describe it as being lanky yet strong looking. If it was just an optical illusion, he wouldn't have been able to make out so much detail. Plus, when the headlights hit an inanimate object, there is very little chance the shadow created would look like it was running. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it just doesn't seem to me like it would create the illusion of running. Plus, there's the fact he said it was running in the opposite direction of his car, which means at some point it would have been out of the range of the headlights once it was to the side of the car and behind it. Then there's how he says he felt when he saw this thing, which aligns with what I hear in just about every story I come across, that this thing just felt off. Also, he says, just like in the first story, that he feels like he wasn't supposed to see this thing, or that it wasn't supposed to exist. Another thing I see in a lot of cryptid stories is how fast he says this thing was running. As for what I think it could have been, when he said lanky, I thought crawler. He did, however, say it was black and strong looking, which makes me think that it could have been a dogman. Some of them, especially juveniles, are described as being slender or even lanky, but most of them are described as being muscular or strong looking. Both cryptids I mentioned are said to be extremely fast. What do you think he saw that night? A creature or an optical illusion created by his headlights? And if you do think it was a cryptid, what do you think it was? The final story of this episode comes from a poster who shares his roommate's encounter with a strange creature one evening while hunting. This story takes place in Hungary and goes to show that the cryptid phenomenon and the rising amount of encounters is a worldwide occurrence. The original poster's friend was out hunting with his father, who is a seasoned hunter and often took his son along. The father is also employed by the equivalent to our National Guard and isn't easily scared. One night they were out camping in a meadow near a forest during early autumn. During dinner they began to hear rustling coming from the nearby woods. He mentions here that the friend says it wasn't uncommon to have wildlife around. Eventually they decided to investigate, and as they approached they recognized it as a wild boar. But just as the father was preparing to take a shot, something large emerged to their right. The darkness obscured their view, but they were about 300 meters at most from this thing, and the grass was short, revealing that it was either crouching or lying down. However, it stood up then and was clearly walking on 2 legs. It was also definitely not human. The creature had dark fur, distinct canine features, and glowing eyes. It glanced over at them before casually walking away. They stood there completely frozen by fear. The OP's friend told him that he had never experienced such an intense fear in his entire life. Without a second thought, they both sprinted to the car, leaped inside, and sped away. Interestingly, his father had encountered a similar sight while on patrol, but the OP can't recall the details of that story. He closes by saying that his friend, when telling the story, was clearly afraid and on guard the entire time. He posted the story online hoping someone finds the account intriguing. Hunting wild boars are scary enough with how aggressive they can be, but to see something like that emerge from the darkness as you're doing so, that would be terrifying. By the way he describes it either being crouched or lying down makes me think that it could have been hunting the boar as well. But if that's the case, why would it just turn and walk away? Perhaps because it was spotted? I can't really say for sure. As for what this thing could have been, it seems to me that this thing was a dogman, given that the father and son in the story said it had distinct canine features. This thing also had glowing eyes, which is very common in dogman stories. Being that dogmen are also said to be very aggressive, they are lucky it simply turned and walked away. This also isn't the first cryptid story I've heard coming out of Hungary either, but it comes as no surprise to me that stories like this are coming in from all over the world, being that the cryptid phenomenon has proven to be global. What do you think about this one? And what would you do if you were camping at night and you saw a large creature emerge from the darkness? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.